So this is the Cyclone, and it was one of two large dredges and a number of small dredges that were used by the Toronto Harbour Commission to reshape the waterfront in the early part of the 20th century. The Harbour Commission started out with a waterfront development plan with a time frame of about 8 years. I think it took longer, in fact. But what they were attempting to do was to redesign the waterfront, and this was their idea for the central waterfront. It included at that time creating a new Western Gap, which is the Western Gap that we have today, and creating a roadway that ran across the Western Gap, right across through the Toronto Islands and out over across the Eastern Gap. That roadway never happened. And redevelopment of the Ashbridges Bay Marsh over here in the East Portlands. So the eastern section of the waterfront development plan was primarily an industrial section, as in fact it turned out to be, with a strip of parkland along here on the Lake Ontario edge. It also included redevelopment of the central waterfront here to create a more organized system of railway and ship access. But we go back a little earlier to early Toronto shorelines. This is a painting of about the Battle of York in 1813, American ships. But what I think is of interest is the view of the Toronto Harbour at that time. What you can see right here is Fort York, and over here is Toronto Island. The lighthouse, as you can see, is right there. This was a blockhouse with a cannon to cover the passageway into the harbor. This was the only entranceway. And there was a large sandbar right here that made the entrance quite narrow. Ships entering Toronto Harbor would come right past in front of Fort York. Over time and through natural forces, the harbor changed a great deal. So in 1818, it looked like this. The lighthouse had already been built by that time. There was very little in terms of a town or a city, just a couple of wharves on the harbor side and a marsh here in the east. With currents and silting and so on, these sandbars grew over time, and they posed a continuous problem for entrance into the harbor. By 1841, Queen's Wharf was already formed, and that Queen's Wharf is about where Bathurst Street and Lakeshore is today. 1882 saw these the silting spreading even further in, and as a result, ships entering the harbor had considerable difficulty. It was getting shallower and shallower, and they couldn't dredge much deeper because they were hitting into bedrock here. So by 1911, they had actually created a new channel and started this project of rebuilding the Toronto waterfront. So you can see in 1911, there was the old Western Channel and the new Western Channel. In other words, for a period, there were two Western Gaps. And the National Yacht Club is right about here now. You can see from this map that the water depths were actually quite shallow. As ships were getting larger and the need for shipping increased, this water was really only about 10 feet deep in through here. And along the wharf side, it was 11 feet deep. And as you know, the lake itself fluctuates. So 11 feet was not a guarantee that you would have enough draft for ships. Over in the eastern harbor, it was much shallower still, with the Humber, or so with the Don River flowing in. The Queen's Wharf was built out further, and the city started to grow. So it grew out as far as what's now Niagara Street. So you can see Niagara Street here, which actually follows the line of Garrison Creek, which is now underground. Everything to the west of that was all leased to the military as a military reserve for 1,000 years. I don't know when that was changed, but it was intended that way. And then there were 50 acres granted up here to the lunatic asylum on Queen Street, which was and still is an institution there in South CMHC. So as time went on, this is about 1860, you can see an infrastructure of wharves forming along the waterfront, and railway lines were coming in, you can see, to service these wharves. And even to a greater degree here. I'll skip there and say that the early inner harbor in that case actually was modern in the sense of newly built and industrial, but it was certainly no recreational area. This is the original Union Station near the foot of York Street. And you can see that between Union Station and the waterfront, there were train lines running. This is one of a number of sort of aerial views of the city waterfront, and included in much of it were grain elevators and so on. There's the Union Station there, and then looking off to the east, you can see it was a very busy waterfront, and rather fully occupied. These are fairly accurate renderings, actually, of what was there at the time. But the process of lake filling began even before the Harbour Commission started its plan in 1911. So you can see here, this is 1884, and already what you see is a crib work here. This is John Street, and this area is going to be filled in. And you can see railway spur lines running right out onto the wharves. And you can also see recreational sailboats already on the waterfront here. There's Fort York, Queen's Wharf, and the waterfront all the way across. The yacht clubs at the time were on the central waterfront on the city side. And you can see here the Toronto Canoe Club and the Argonaut Rowing Club. There were other proposed waterfronts, as there always have been. This is an early proposal, 1852. Here's Front Street running along here, and this proposal had actually just a section of pleasure drives, walks, and shrubbery for the recreation of the citizens. The handwriting is a little more pessimistic. This design seems altogether too ornamental, and it of course never happened. This was a different proposal for the waterfront, which included rail terminals all the way along. One thing to notice here, of course, are the Parliament buildings, which now are up at Queen's Park, but Parliament Street was named after the location of Parliament buildings at the time. And here's another proposed waterfront again in the industrial line. Freight depots, shipbuilding, and so on across the waterfront. One defining characteristic of these waterfront proposals a little later was this particular line right here. This is the natural shoreline in darker gray. This line was called the windmill line. And the windmill line was drawn from the Gooderham and Worts windmill on the shore here, lined up to what it says, the late French fort. The late French fort was over on the C&E grounds. In fact, there's an obelisk there now. That was a 1750 fort. And this line essentially lines up with the current waterfront in the Eastern Harbour, but it also lines up with the Western Gap. This was the intention, at least, that that lake filling in the harbor would come out to the windmill line, but not any further. Did that happen? For the most part, yes. So this 1860 design actually was largely implemented when things came together. However, in 1869, you still had a ramshackle waterfront. By this point, you had a new fort being built on what's now the exhibition grounds of the CNE right here. It became later the Stanley Barracks. Over here, the garrison, usually called the Old Fort. Here it's called the Old Garrison, is what we now call Fort York. Very little exists now of the Stanley Barracks. The old fort lasted longer. One other little detail here on this map and on a couple of others, here it says asylum forcing engine. What that was a pumping system to pump water up to the Queen Street, the lunatic asylum as it was called at the time up here. It had its own lake water supply. Bathurst Quay was a major area of development, but you can see in this aerial photograph, and this is a contemporary, like today, this is the windmill line right here. And if you follow it tracks over to the CNE grounds. Fort Rui was over here, and the windmill is gone now. Although there is a marker in the ground for people who want to see where it was located. The National Yacht Club was located on Queen's Wharf, and Queen's Wharf itself eventually became filled in. The Western Gap, the old Western Gap, was filled in, and the lighthouse entranceway to the harbor was landlocked. The new, that is, old new National Yacht Club was built. And here we get into views of the dredge. This is the Cyclone actually dredging the inner basin where National Yacht Club and Alexandra Yacht Club are still located today. And that's the National Yacht Club clubhouse, not its current, but the previous one, under construction. A view from this area looking northward, this line of cars is parked on dirt that is now Stadium Road. Here's the old lighthouse, now landlocked behind what has become Lakeshore Boulevard. And this is a view from the exhibition grounds, view part of Stanley Barracks, it says. It's from a roller coaster on the CNE grounds. It was not, this is not the, what was it, the Flyer. It's not the Flyer, it was an earlier roller coaster. But the Stanley Barracks exists now only with this part of this building integrated into Hotel X. The rest is gone. But what you can see of interest in the background, again, is one of the dredges operating right here inside the break wall. The National Yacht Club building, it's very hazy, was right there. This is a somewhat clearer view from a similar perspective. This is looking across the CNE grounds racetrack with motorcycle racing happening here, spectators, cars, the Stanley Barracks, and then a view into the basin with National Yacht Club here, the Ackroyd building and Taylor Boat Works in here, and finally out over into the inner harbor in the far background with it looks like RCYC up over here. That lighthouse stayed landlocked until the late 1920s. So at this point, the lighthouse is sitting here. The new Maple Leaf Stadium has been built at the corner of Stadium Road and Lakeshore Boulevard. National Yacht Club building is here, and that is the extreme end of the Western Gap, the lighthouse that is actually still there today. It's a part of a range light system for the Western Gap. That old lighthouse you would still recognize today, but it's not in its current location is not its original location. It's over on Fleet Street outside the CNE grounds. This is a view looking eastward from the old National Yacht Club. These buildings here are the Stanley Barracks, not the Stanley Barracks, I'm sorry, Little Norway. The grain elevators that are still there today, the Royal York Hotel, and I guess that's the Imperial Bank of Commerce building there. This dates the picture pretty much to mid 1940s, probably. Maybe a little earlier, maybe 1942. So National Yacht Club at the time had a marine railway, and these boats were on skids. Then they would go down this railway. Inside this little building was an old steam engine. Eventually that area was filled in, and there was further lake filling happening in here. So Bathurst Quay, in fact, all of this area is lake fill. The original shoreline of the waterfront runs along here down Lakeshore Boulevard like so. So everything in this area is all lake-filled area. Queen's Wharf was right where that Loblaws building is here down in the corner. That Loblaws building was taken down just recently and then reconstructed into a multi-story condo, and the facade was reattached. You can see that if you get down in that area. As projects have happened along the waterfront, what they have tended to do is to excavate for foundations of bigger buildings and turned up, in doing so, parts of older buildings and wharves. These are parts of Queen's Wharf here. This is the Lakeshore Boulevard and Gardner Expressway here. Fort York is right over here. And this was pretty close to the launching point for National Yacht Club and other things. The island airport also is largely lake fill. There was the existing sandbars, and over on the island there were lots of things happening, including a whole recreational area with a roller coaster, as you can see, and diving horses, and a hotel, and a ball stadium. This was the formation of the new Western Channel. And this is another view. If we go right about here, you can see there's the roller coaster, a water tower, a ball stadium, and between the ball stadium and the water tower is where the horse diving was. If you go back to the horse diving, you can see the water tower and the roller coaster here. So that diving horse was landing in the water about here, which is now part of the island airport. So the dredging filled in this entire area here and portions of this. This photograph I think is quite interesting because it's taken right at the time when the Western Gap had been built. That little nub out there is the little lighthouse that's still there it's now built into the airport land. And there's the old National Yacht Club. Most of the land that the airport is on didn't exist until lake filling occurred. So the lake filling occurred here in stages 1908, 1916, and through 1937 and 38, when it started to take the shape that was needed for it to be an airport. At that point, this was all filling in. And inside this tree line, which was original sandbar, you can see houses and so on. In fact, you can see even a little bit of the old roller coaster right back here. So in its original form, the airport took this footprint. At that time, Maple Leaf Stadium was here on the city side. And the runways are not in quite the same configuration today. But there was an addition to the land here in 1961 that actually changed this east-west capacity for a runway to something a bit longer and something that didn't point so much directly at the city. Keep remembering all of this, virtually all of this lake filling was done up until the mid-30s by these large dredges from the Toronto Harbour Commission. This is airport construction. Construction of the tunnel to the island. This was started and stopped in 1935, stopped with a change of government. When they did actually finally get around to building the tunnel in 2015, they did find some of the pilings for this original construction from 1935. What you can see here, this little sort of girderwork tower actually still exists. You may have seen it sailing in and out of the harbor. And here again is that little girderwork tower. It's part of the range light system for the Western Gap. This is the beginning of construction for the airport terminal. So you're on the airport lands looking north to the city. And pouring foundations for the terminal itself under construction. That terminal building is not used now for the airport, but it exists still. It was moved to the south part of the airport lands with the intention of becoming, the Harbour or the Port Authority said, a restaurant, but it's just sitting there at the moment. a little more airport construction. It also included and still includes capacity for float planes. And this is a view looking southwest. Probably somebody climbed up that girderwork tower and took a picture of the very newly filled airport land right here. That little thing there, again, is the range light, the outer range light for the Western Gap. People think of it as a lighthouse, but it's really meant just as a way of sighting a line up between the end of the Western Gap and the inside. Access to the island was originally on this cable ferry. Not quite as elegant as things are now. You can see the Tip Top Taylor building here in the background. One of the first flights into the island airport. And the terminal building in its initial grandeur. It looks as smooth as a putting green. In fact, it's all very level, it being intentionally so. Here's the cable ferry approaching the island side for the airport. You can see in this shot clearly the cable. They actually kind of missed their target a little bit here. That cable was obviously something for sailors to consider as they were crossing the Western Gap. They didn't want to cross when the ferry was in motion because the cable would be near or above the surface. Here's another float plane view. This is looking east across the harbor. What you can see up in the corner here is the terminal warehouse that still exists today, renovated into condominiums. The Norwegian Air Force located at the island airport for a period for pilot training because Norway was occupied by Germany, so the Air Force worked in Canada. After a couple of crashes, one into a ferry, the Norwegian Air Force moved Little Norway up to Muskoka. So the central waterfront, as we know it now, really started to take shape in this period here of, this is around 1910, when already you're starting to see lake filling happening. And this Harbour Commission building still exists today. Pretty much everything else in view in this shot is not there, including the yacht clubs that relocated Queen City and RCYC over to the island. But this shot is an interesting one because it shows the construction of the current shoreline of the inner harbor at the western end. So girder work was set up like this, walls, and the filling was pumped in behind to fill in this area here. What you can see over here again is the Western Gap National Yacht Club, and you can actually see one of the dredges here, probably the Cyclone or perhaps its sister, the Typhoon. And it's dredging in here and pumping dredgeate over to here. You can actually see the hose that the dredge was using. So this is literally formation of the inner harbor. And you can see that the natural shoreline is far in from where the current shoreline is. The harbor, apart from its industrial side, also had its recreational side, ice boating, recreational sailing, and so on. Here we have probably one of the last bits of yacht club activity on the inner harbor, because this is all being filled in now. This picture is a photograph taken from the roof of the Harbour Commission building at 60 Harbour Street. It's still there. Everything else here is gone. You can see the Western Gap off in the distance. You can see a dredge in operation right down here. And you can see a couple of the recreational sailboats still in place before they were relocated over to the island. This is the foot of York Street being filled in. And they didn't really care what went into the filling. This is one of the city dredges. This one is not like the Cyclone. This one is a steam shovel sort of dredge. And this, the hydraulic dredge is pumped through large pipes. And again, we have some ice boats out here in the inner harbor. This is 1926. I'll skip through those and just point out that now you have really a reconstructed waterfront here. This is the line that exists now, say between York Street and Bathurst. Where you have kayaking today, you had rail cars. This is the foot of Reese Street. So this wall is still there as a harbor wall, but you don't have oil tankers coming in, filling up steam engines anymore. You've got kayakers and paddle boats and little rental motorboats. It's completely different. The recreation had moved over to the island by this time. Here's an early shot of some international 14s. This is, I don't know who sailed KC6, but there they are at that point. And for a while after, international 14s looked a lot like albacores. There's KC8 over there, and this might be the stern of one of the tenders for the RCYC. Royal York Hotel, clearly in view. As the harbor excavation works proceed, of course, to old crib work shows up from the old work. The Portlands were a different project altogether. They were intended strictly as industrial, and the plans took different forms, but this one includes parkland along in here and grain elevators over here, gas works, lumber yards, coal yards, and so on, ice houses. The new cut is actually the Keating Cut. Ashbridge's Bay, as it's shown here, doesn't exist, nor can you actually sail right through to the eastern end here, which is, this is all filled. Going back in time, that area was marshland, as this early shot shows. This is 1893. But in 1993, there was a very active industrial waterfront here with the Gooderham and Worts Distillery and the Don River flowing in here. This is another Ashbridge's Bay reclamation plan. Again, with a waterfront park and a whole industrial area. The reality was maybe a little different. That is to say, this is the bridge in 1898 over the Keating Cut. So this is Cherry Street, heading south. And to get to that bridge over Cherry Street, you had to cross a whole pathway of rail lines. So, and that took you down into what's now the Portlands. Another plan for the Portlands is here and another here. The dredging process, though, that turned that whole marsh into land was conducted by these hydraulic dredges and others, including the Cyclone. And they are dredging the Keating Cut here. And their pipes are pumping out over the marsh. So this whole large wetland was being turned into the industrial Portlands. Down at Cherry Beach also, you can see dredging happening. This is, as it says here, new land, Fisherman's Island. This is 1915. So what we call now the Outer Harbour Cherry Beach area was also constructed land. Took me a little while to figure out where this was, partly because the vantage point of the photograph doesn't exist anymore. But this is the Cherry Street Bridge, and it's looking across into the Toronto Inner Harbour. So it's looking southwest from the Cherry Street Bridge. However, it's not the Cherry Street Bridge that you know. That is the Cherry Street Bridge, not the bridge that's in place that looks like that further to the south on Cherry Street. So for a while, there were two what are called bascule bridges on Cherry Street. One across the Keating Cut and one across the entranceway into the turning basin. The turning basin was much busier also at the time. This is 1931, and you can see ships unloading coal and so on, all down both sides of that the turning basin channel. And there is the Cherry Street Bridge, the lower bascule bridge, 1934 Dodge in the foreground. I think most of us are familiar with that bridge. And this is the Keating Cut Bridge. So again, very similar. 1949 Ford in front. Another part of the formation here, the turning basin is here. This is now the the Hearn generating station. This is about 1953. The generating station still exists, but this shoreline has changed dramatically. And you can see it starts with, again, lake filling here at the foot of Leslie Street in 1963. This is a future vision from last year of what that northwestern corner of the Portlands will become. The Don River now is going to be routed this way. The Keating Channel will still exist. Cherry Street will run down this way. And there'll be it'd be essentially new riverland in here. Toronto Island was another site for lake filling. Ward's Island in 1911 was a tent town, created again with dredging. And here you can see the tents of Ward's Island, the Queen City Yacht Club of the time, and dredging operations here, creating the Eastern Gap, I'm sorry. Another one of the Toronto dredges. And concurrent with this were sites of shipbuilding along the waterfront. This is one of the later images of shipbuilding on the waterfront. This is 1917 shipbuilding for the war effort. But it started earlier. This shot is a picture of the launching of the SS Corona in 1896, about 300-foot long ship. This ship is landing in the water about where Dan Leckie Way and Lakeshore Boulevard meet today. And it was built by the Bertram Engine Works, a company that existed on the waterfront from 1892 until 1905. The Bertram Engine Works built a number of ships. At the end of the dock here, you can also see this is not the Trillium, although it's a sister ship to the Trillium. This particular one is called the Primrose. Another one of these large ships you can see in the background already at the dock, the Chippewa. This is the Corona underway, heading out the Eastern Gap over to Niagara. So a side wheel steamer. Also built at the Bertram Engine Works was the Hiawatha in its earlier days, in its modern. And here's the actual launch of the Hiawatha in 1895. That's the Primrose that appeared earlier in the shots. There were a series of ferries, island ferries, operated by the Toronto Ferry Company, the Primrose, the Bluebell, the Trillium that still exists, the Mayflower, the Jasmine, the Luella, named after wildflowers. And here's the Cayuga coming out through the Eastern Gap. Obviously, the view out the Eastern Gap now has the outer harbor, but at the time it went straight out into the lake. It also had a little lighthouse at the end. There was one on the inside too. These lighthouses actually still exist, but they are relocated to Humber Bay Park West near Mimico Cruising Club and Etobicoke Yacht Club. These were magnificent ships built in Toronto for Toronto passenger use. Can you imagine? This is how people went back and forth to Niagara. Also in the shipbuilding on the waterfront here was the Polson Iron Works that built some large vessels, some interesting vessels, including the Cyclone and the Typhoon dredges and some other dredges. This is the Bluebell, sister ship to the Trillium, being launched at the Polson Iron Works in 1906. You can actually even see, I think maybe not yet. So Bluebell was launched, operated in the harbor for a long time, and eventually wound up out here. If you don't know where this is, it's right there on the point of part of the Tommy Thompson Park, right out here. If you zoom in on Google Maps, you'll be able to see the Bluebell in its rather sad state. This is another one of the dredges created at Polson Iron Works. This one went up to Port Nelson and had a very short life before it went aground in a storm. The Cyclone was a massive thing, as you can see from these statistics. 170-foot long dredge, one of the largest in the world, a beam of 42 feet. And it had a 24-inch discharge pipe, so it could move a lot of dredgeate in a hurry. And that's the big impeller digging up the bottom there, lifted out of the water in this shot. Normally it would be down in the water, pumping dredgeate up through the pipe systems. So the Cyclone, coal-fired giant piece of machinery. Here's another one of these dredges. I don't know whether this is the Cyclone or the Typhoon. It's one of those two being towed through the gap by a tug. So many of the early pictures of the waterfront show dredges with these huge plumes of smoke pumping out. This tugboat, the Geary, was also built at Polson Iron Works and operated in the harbor for quite a while. And Knapp's roller boat, which is a story unto itself. I think I did talk about it previously a little bit. This was a vanity project of insanity, I think. Vanity or insanity, I'm not sure which. This thing was supposed to roll along on its side. Steam powered, kind of like a, I don't know, toilet paper roll floating in the water. It had a bad end. Eventually they tried to make it work the other way. They put a bow on it and a stern and so on, but it eventually just sat up on the shoreline near Polson Iron Works. This is 1911. It was built in 1897. And here it is in its last known photograph that I can know of anyway, in 1920. It's sitting on the shore at the Polson Iron Works. The Polson Iron Works is no longer in operation by this time. It's being cannibalized for scrap metal. In the background, you can see the Quassind or the Hiawatha here, the Harbour Commission building here, and the terminal warehouse here. And if you can visualize where this is sitting, it's actually right here under Lakeshore Boulevard between Jarvis and Sherburne. So here's Lower Jarvis Street here. Here's Sherburne here. And this is Lakeshore Boulevard Gardner Expressway. This line is the original Toronto shoreline. The orange things mark buildings in there. So the Polson Iron Works was right at Lower Sherburne at Lakeshore Boulevard right there. And the Knapp's roller boat, as far as is known, is buried underneath Lakeshore Boulevard right here to this day. And then the current waterfront here, as it says, Toronto shoreline. This Toronto shoreline is actually that windmill line that I was talking about from the mid-1800s. Queen's Quay right here comes up into Parliament Street. The Quassind was also built at Polson Iron Works, as was the Trillium. Trillium in 1920, the Quassind in 1912. Much later lake filling was over at Ontario Place, which was kind of a side feature to the C&E grounds. We're into a different stage of lake filling now. And maybe looking at the time, it might be time to pause and leave this for another time. There's still lake filling happening here at Ontario Place, over here in Ashbridges Bay, and obviously the Eastern Headland here, and out in the west in Humber Bay Park East and West. But I will point out that on the exhibition was at one time very much more of a waterfront park. And you can see here in about 1920, a large spectator crowd watching a dinghy race right off the exhibition waterfront. Those dinghies are right now where Ontario Place is today. So Diane, I don't know if now is a good time to wrap up. It's about 10 to 2. I think Graham, you have to unmute Diane.
Diane, I'll have to mute them.
Oh, Diane, you have to unmute yourself, Diane.
If there are any comments or questions from folks, if you've done the reactions at the bottom and put a thumbs up, then Graham will take you you in order.
Judith, yeah, you have a question. Please unmute yourself.
Ron, I hope you're planning on writing a book, because that's fantastic. It's just so interesting to see the harbor front, and I live right downtown, as you know, and see it change. And now it's just changing again all around me, all these huge buildings going up. But having watched them excavate the market, excavate the building at Church and the Esplanade, I didn't see them excavate here. This is all reclaimed land here. But I hope you're planning on taking this further. I watched the first one, and this one was amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's interesting to see that excavation that happened at the market, because I don't know if you noticed that they had excavated what was called the Porcupine Sewer, I think they called it.
I didn't know what they called it, but the one that ran north and south?
Yes, out of old stonework that was actually underneath the St. Lawrence Market. When they took the market away, they found this old sewer pipe that was made out of stone right underneath.
I wasn't sure what that was. It had an odd shape. I also knew that somewhere in that immediate vicinity was the remains of ovens, public ovens. People didn't have stoves in the early days, and so they brought their bread and their whatever they needed to cook to a central place, and it was somewhere in there. But I didn't know it was a sewer pipe.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of interesting to see it show up, because it had not been. I think nobody really knew that it was there until the building was pulled out from above it.
Okay, so it'll be Liz next, then Margaret, then Julia. Liz, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Well, I just found it extraordinarily interesting, and he presents it all so well, and he obviously enjoys doing all the research. And what a job to put it together. I'm very impressed. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Margaret? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Further to the Polson Ironworks, the SS Klondike, which is on shore up on the Yukon River in Whitehorse, is a Polson boat. And it had the sign on it when I saw it, and it was quite fascinating to think of it.
There are a few Polson ironwork boats still around, including the Klondike, the Quasind, and there's a small tugboat too, I think, also still in existence.
Thank you for a wonderful display of our city.
Julia, go ahead if you unmute yourself.
Ron, I was very impressed. It's really, I should have known you when I was doing my study on the Toronto development and the waterfront. Thank you very much for all of that. My question is about the ice sailing. I have never seen or heard of ice sailing, of course, coming from Australia.
Oh,
So please tell me, how did you do this?
well, the ice sailing was a fairly significant feature of the inner harbor for a while, until the ferries started running through the winter and actually breaking the ice surface up. Before that, it would form a pretty good surface. And people still do ice boat in the harbor, although it's usually up closer in the protected area near the harbor. I think the McLaughlin family has an ice boat that they put out there a year or two ago.
Ron,
What does an ice boat have underneath to keep it going in the direction that you want it to, besides the sail? You know, underneath a yacht, you've got all sorts of gizmos. You know, you've got a keel down the center. Is that right? I'm not a yachtsman.
Well, the ice boat has runners that are somewhat like skate blades, usually in a triangular form. And one of them is for steering, and then a sail and a cockpit.
Wow, thank you.
Ron, can I ask a question? We did have a presentation about ice boating a few years ago. I don't know if it's on the web. Do you know?
I don't recall it, so it must be
Okay.
from a few years back.
Yeah, it was a few years back. I'll look it up and maybe we can get that speaker back again, because it was fascinating and I don't know what they're doing now.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, Graham. Who's next?
Are there any more questions?
Sherry? You have to unmute yourself.
There we go. I'm unmuted. It's Alan.
Okay, Alan.
I think Sherry's first, but she hasn't unmuted herself.
Well,
Okay, go ahead, Alan.
well, thank you so much. I'm finally made myself a sandwich. Anyhow, Ron,
Oh, I've unmuted, I think.
Okay, Sherry,
Well done.
just Sherry, wait till Alan's finished and we'll get back to you.
just
Go ahead.
wanted to
Go
say, Ron, I really enjoyed the depth of your presentation. Some of it I'm familiar with, harbor headlines, stuff like that. And being an islander, having lived in the harbor for virtually most of my life, or being in it or on it, you've brought us a broad background to how we are, how we've come from, and where we're going to. And the next 10 or 15 years is really going to be interesting, particularly in the east end of the harbor. Thank you so much for today.
You're welcome. Yes, the Eastern Harbor is going to be a different place over the next 10, 15 years. That's definitely.
Okay, go ahead, Sherry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, my question is, not a question, but I have to comment. First of all, your presentation, Ron, was fantastic. Secondly, I'd like to say that I'm absolutely in shock, and that the fact that all that where they've put the landfill in is able to sustain the huge amount of condos that are all over by the lakeshore. And I absolutely find that almost shocking that
May
the
I?
landfill they did was able to sustain all these amazing buildings.
Well, those buildings are not sitting on the lake fill. They're actually dug down further and sitting on a bedrock. So the
No.
footings of those buildings are not on sand.
May I
Yes.
interject?
George was next. We'll get back to you. Go ahead, George.
Thank you.
Two interesting
George.
things that are about to happen. One is the Keating Channel Bridge for Cherry Street is about to be delivered from Halifax on a barge. and lifted into place on the new alignment of Cherry Street. It has some resemblance to the Polson roller ship. The second is I live in a building in the distillery that is sitting on those piles into the bedrock, and
Thank you.
Doug Ford is about to build the Ontario line right under our piles.
Yeah,
Ontario line?
yeah, the Ontario line is a subway line in Doug Ford's mind. I'm not sure it's got much reality in practice.
Well, it certainly is being presented as a fait accompli. There are public meetings and discussions over station location and how it's going to cross the Don River and dive under the distillery without compromising the landform that has been built in Corktown Common.
Yeah, the subway line is designed and drawn underneath many things that go rather deep down into the ground already. I don't know if they've actually really thought out the implications of trying to build a subway line underneath a parking garage that's already extant.
Alan, go ahead. Go ahead, Alan.
I just wanted to expand on something that George touched on and clarify what Ron had mentioned. Everything along the waterfront, of course, is on soup when you come right down to it. So nothing is able to be held up with a normal foundation. The buildings are held up on caissons that go to bedrock, which varies from 40 to 60 feet below the land surface. But nothing is there without those piles to bedrock, as you are sitting on now, George.
Good.
Are
That's
there
one
any other questions or comments?
Okay.
I have.
Oh, one more?
Yes, just speaking of, hello, just speaking of the Polson Iron Works, there are a couple of Polson Iron Work ships up here in Muskoka, still operating.
What are they?
Pardon?
Can you tell me what boats there are?
The Mildred, the Rambler, the Wanda 3. There are probably more, but the Wanda 3 is under repair right now. It's only
The Polson Iron Works was prolific, created a lot of ships. There is a website that has a listing of the ships that they produced, and it was quite a few, and some very big ones.
yes.
I can remember, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Alan.
No, I just, when you're talking about Polson and shipbuilding on the waterfront, as a youngster, I can remember corvettes and subchasers being side launched at the bottom of Bathurst. And I do remember, of course, Taylor Boat Works, even though I was a stripling at the time.
Just a stripling.
Just a stripling.
I have a couple of questions before we go. I'm just wondering, you said the Primrose was the sister ship of the Trillium. Was the Trillium that was the one that was found on one of the islands and restored? We did have
Yes.
a presentation back then, and I think that the name of the presenter has gone out of my head. But in any event, I thought we did have a presentation about that. And I guess the second question is, we're going to, if you do come back and talk about the eastern end of the harbor, do you know at this point whether there's any thought to putting any marshland in there to restore some of what was there?
The artificial river that will be built will have something like a natural shoreline or a natural seeming shoreline. So it's not going to be constructed the way that the dock walls have been constructed through the harbor now.
Okay. Okay. Well, Ron, I would just like to echo what so many people have said already. That was an amazing presentation. You have a fount of knowledge, and yes, you should write a book. It's so well researched. You astound me how much you can remember even when you're looking at the maps. And so I'd like everybody just to give him a silent clap here, because I just think you've done an amazing job. Thank you so much.
Does he get a virtual pin?
Can I get in
Yes,
this?
a virtual pin. I was thinking about that. I think I'm actually going to mail them to people, seriously, because this is, you take no less time in preparing than you do when you have to get in front of somebody. So thank you again, Ron, and we'll look forward to your presentation on the eastern end of the harbor, and you and I can talk about when that might be feasible.
All right.
Next week, we have Bill Hutton, and he takes us on a planned journey from Bermuda to Rhode Island, but the journey was interrupted by a rescue